Hello everyone, Miss Carol here. Thanks again for joining me as we continue our lessons. I want to apologize because we were unable to get a video out last week due to our office staff being a little short-handed and no one able to upload a video. But hopefully we'll get this one out this week. But we're going to skip over the rest of the Judges for now. We're going to come back to those next week, and we're going to move on to the book of Ruth. And it's only 4 chapters long, but it's a wonderful, wonderful love story. And it's near and dear to my heart, so I'm anxious to share this story with you. So let's just get right in and begin with Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. If you remember, a famine is when there is no rain, there's no food that grows. Now the man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. They had 2 sons named Mahlon and Chilion. And they went to Moab and lived there. But now Elimelech died, Naomi's husband died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They eventually married 2 women from Moab. Mahlon married a woman named Ruth, and Chilion married a woman named Oprah. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion died. Now Naomi was left without her 2 sons and without her husband. So when she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of the people in Israel, then she wanted to go back home because God was providing food for them once again. So Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return back to Judah from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." And then she kissed them, and they cried out loud, and they said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you to leave, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this they cried again. But then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye and decided to return back home. But Ruth replied, now these are some of the most beautiful verses in the Bible, "Don't beg me to leave you or to return and go back from you, because where you go, I will go, and where you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And may the Lord deal with me ever so harshly, if anything but death separates me from you." And when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped begging her to stay. And isn't that a beautiful story? Ruth loved her mother-in-law. You know, that tells us a lot about what Naomi must have been like. And I think she must have had a beautiful, loving, generous, caring heart. But I also think that Ruth, who was an idol worshiper before she married, I think she saw in Naomi the true and living God shining through in her life. And I think she wanted that for herself. And I want to stop right now, and I want to just tell you another true story. The story of Ruth and Naomi is true, of course, but I want to give you a more recent story that's also a true story, and it begins with 2 very different women who were born well over 100 years ago. One of them married and had 7 sons and 2 daughters, and the other woman married and had 2 sons and 3 daughters. Now, they both lived in small towns in Arkansas, only about 8 miles apart. But to my knowledge, they had never met one another until one day, the oldest son of the one woman fell in love with the oldest daughter of the other woman. And eventually, those two got married. So those 2 women became mothers-in-law together. Now, because their personalities were very different in many ways, I don't think they were ever especially close with one another. But their children were married to one another, of course. But then one day, something special happened that I think brought them closer than ever. One day, a traveling preacher came into town, and he held a gospel meeting in a tent. Both women, as well as their married son and daughter, came to that gospel meeting. And they listened to the gospel of Christ that preacher told them. And they decided to all be baptized. Now, there was no baptistry, so they had to go down to the river, and they were all baptized in that river. Now, they all remained faithful Christians until the day they died, with the exception of the married son. And eventually, he chose the ways of the world, and he chose to leave behind Christ. But as time went by, the daughter-in-law grew closer and closer to her mother-in-law, and a strong bond of love joined them together. Now, that bond was one that was never going to be broken, even though the marriage between the son and the daughter-in-law eventually was broken apart. That loving mother-in-law, who was known to everyone as Mama Long, she had 23 grandchildren, all of whom were quite positive that they were their grandmother's favorite. And she was the kindest, most gentle, loving, and generous, and had the most godly heart of anyone I ever knew. Now, I'm telling you this story because it's the true story of my mother and her mother-in-law, who was my wonderful grandma, Mama Long. My mother dearly loved her mother-in-law, always and forever, and my Mama Long loved my mother just as though she was her own daughter. And they remained that way until the day they both died. And that is why I especially love the story of Ruth and Naomi, because it means a lot and it reminds me of my mom and my grandma. So now let's continue reading in Ruth chapter 1 and begin with verse 19. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. They arrived in Bethlehem, and the whole town was stirred up because of them. And the women said, "Can this be Naomi?" Naomi said, "Don't call me Naomi." Her name meant pleasant. "Call me Mara," which means bitter, because of all that has happened to me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. So Naomi returned from Moab, and Ruth came with her, who was her daughter-in-law, and they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone and whose eyes will let me do that." If they will let me go behind and pick up that leftover grain, I'm going to do it. And Naomi said, Go ahead, daughter." So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to a man named Boaz, who just happened to be a relative of Naomi's dead husband, Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he said. "The Lord bless you," said the harvesters. And Boaz asked the foreman of the harvesters, "Whose young woman is that?" And the foreman replied, "She is the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She went into the field and she worked steadily from morning until now, except for a very short rest in the shelter." So Boaz went over to Ruth and he said to her, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in any other field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after my girls. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." And at this she bowed down with her face to the ground, and she said, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you would notice me, a stranger in a strange land?" And Boaz replied to her, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and your mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you never knew before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take shelter." "Well, may I continue to find favor in your eyes, my lord," she said. "You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I don't even deserve to be spoken kindly to because don't even have the rank of a servant." And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." And when she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. As she ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Just leave her alone. Rather, pull out some more stalks for her and leave some for her to pick up." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening, and then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about half a bushel. And she carried it back to town, and she showed her mother-in-law how much she had gathered. And Ruth also brought out the rest of her lunch that she had left over and gave it to Naomi. And her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law all about the man that was with her, whose name was Boaz. "The Lord bless him," said Naomi to her daughter-in-law. "The Lord has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. That man is our close relative. He's our kinsman redeemer." We'll talk about that more in a minute. Then Ruth the Moabitess said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finished harvesting all my grain.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's fields you could come to some harm." So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. And one day Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I should try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for. And Boaz is our nearest kinsman redeemer. In other words, he could save us by marrying you. And so here's what I want you to do. Tonight they'll be finishing up threshing all the wheat and the barley, and they're going to be at the threshing floor. And when you hide, and when you see Boaz lay down to go to sleep, I want you to go and lie down at his feet, and he's going to tell you what you need to do after that." And Ruth said, "I'll do whatever you say." So that night Ruth waits until they finish threshing the barley and the wheat. She hides. When Boaz finally lays down to go to sleep, she goes and lays down by his feet. And he woke up and he said, "Who is this that's laying by me?" And she said, "It is Ruth the Moabitess. And my mother-in-law Naomi said, 'You are our nearest kinsman redeemer. Will you help us? And here's what Boaz said. The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you've shown earlier even. You have not run after the younger men, whether they were rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you what you have asked. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am near of kin to you, there is one that's closer than I am. So in the morning, I will go and take care of this. And so she went back home, and her mother-in-law said, how did it go, my daughter? She said, Boaz is going to take care of things. And Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. Meanwhile, Boaz got up and went to the town gate, and he sat there. And when the kinsman redeemer that he had mentioned that was closer to them than he was, when he showed up, he said, come over here, my friend, and sit down. So he went over and sat down. And then Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here. And they did. And then he said to the kinsman redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of those seated here. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, because I will. But I am not allowed to, because you are next in line. But if you say no, I will redeem it. And the man said, no, I'll redeem the land. And then Boaz said, well, here's the thing. On the day that you buy the land from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabitess, you also will get Ruth to be your wife, because it is her husband's land. And in order to keep the land in her husband's family, you must marry her. And at this, the kinsman redeemer said, well, then I can't redeem it, because I don't want to put my own inheritance in danger. So you redeem it. I can't. And now in earlier times in Israel, for someone to redeem land and transfer the property, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was like signing a legal document in Israel. So the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself. And then he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to keep the name of him with his property. So his name will not disappear from his family or from the town records. Today, you are all witnesses. And the elders and those at the gate said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. So the Bible tells us that Boaz took Ruth and they got married. And the Lord gave them a son. And they named that son Obed. And then the women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May this boy become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, Ruth, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to this boy. And then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. And the women living there said, Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed. Now here's the interesting part. And now the Bible gives us the family of Boaz and tells us where Boaz came from and who his family was. And we're going to start back where it says, and Nahshon was the father of Salmon. Wait a minute, Salmon. That name sounds familiar to me. Does it sound familiar to you? Oh yeah, I remember. Back when Joshua had sent out spies to Jericho, do you remember a woman named Rahab who saved those spies from being found by the king? And in return, she said, will you save my life when you come and destroy our city? And they said, our lives for your life. We'll save you. And remember, when they took over the city of Jericho, they saved Rahab and all her family. And the Bible tells us that they took her back to their camp, and she married an Israelite man. And that Israelite's man was, remember, Salmon. And now the Bible tells us that Salmon and Rahab became the father of Boaz. There's Boaz. So who is his mother? His mother is Rahab. Isn't that amazing? And then now we find out that Boaz and his wife Ruth have a son named Obed. Now that even gets better than that. And we find out when Obed grows up, he becomes the father of a man named Jesse. And when Jesse grows up, he becomes the father of a man named David. Oh, we know all about David, don't you? David, the shepherd boy, David, who killed Goliath, David, who became a king. And eventually, David had a son named Solomon, who had a son, who had a son, who had a son. And it takes us all the way down to Joseph, who married a woman named Mary, who became the mother of Jesus. So how did God bless Rahab for saving the lives of those Israelite spies? And how did he bless Ruth? By being there for her mother-in-law and staying with her mother-in-law, taking care of her and loving her. He blessed them both. They now are in the line of all the men and women who are in the line of Jesus Christ. So not only are they in the line of kings of Israel, but also for Jesus Christ. He really blessed those two women, didn't he? I love that story. We have some papers that you can print of Ruth gleaning in the fields. We have a word search right here. And this one, is a little bit harder. So depends on which one you want to work on. But I hope you enjoy this week. We'll see you again next week. Try to be the very best you can be this week. We love you. Bye-bye.